My name is Henry Lawson. I am 76 years old, and most mornings I wake up to the silence of a house that feels far too large for a man who has outlived his wife and who no longer hears the sound of his daughter's voice, except through the distant echo of unanswered calls. I used to believe that silence was a blessing, that after a life of greasy engines, blaring radios in the auto shop, and the constant chatter of customers asking if their cars could last just another winter, I would someday earn the peace and stillness of retirement. But silence is not peace when it means no one cares enough to disturb it. It is a hollow sound, heavy as stone, and it settles on the chest until even breathing feels like an effort. The world outside continues in its rush. Neighbors mowing their lawns, school buses screeching at the corner, delivery vans pulling up to driveways. But in my house, time often feels frozen, as if nothing important will ever happen here again. That is what I believed until the day I tried to step into the house I helped pay for, my daughter's house, and a guard at the gate told me I was blacklisted, as if I were a criminal, as if the blood and labor I had given for my family could be erased with one word. I did not always live in such humiliation. I was born in 1947 in a working-class neighborhood in Joliet, Illinois. My father was a machinist who spent his best years coughing out soot from the steel mill. My mother a quiet woman who worked at the local library and believed in saving every dime, even if it meant eating the same soup 4 nights a week. From them, I learned 2 things: that work was the only path to dignity, and that family was the only treasure worth protecting. Those lessons followed me through life, through decades of tightening bolts, greasing axles, and counting every dollar that passed through my hands. I was never rich, but I was steady, the kind of man who did not walk away from his duties. I married my high school sweetheart, Margaret, and together we built a small but warm home, one that smelled of roast chicken on Sundays and fresh laundry on Saturdays. For 50 years she stood beside me, patient when my back hurt too much to dance, forgiving when I was too proud to say the words, "I need help." Her death 5 years ago left me not only alone, but untethered, like a man cut adrift at sea who has no map and no anchor. The only constant in my life since her passing has been my daughter Karen. At least that is what I told myself, though the truth is harder to swallow. Karen was our only child, born late in our marriage, a surprise when Margaret was already 39 and I was 40. I was terrified I would not live to see her graduate high school, but she grew into a bright, ambitious girl, stubborn in ways that reminded me of her mother, yet sharper, quicker, hungrier than either of us had ever been. We gave her everything we could: music lessons, summer camps, tuition for a private college. Margaret would skip new shoes so Karen could have books. I would work weekends so she could study abroad. We told ourselves it was worth it, that one day she would look back and see how much we had sacrificed. For years, I believed she did. She was affectionate. She called us every week. She brought the grandchildren over on holidays. And in those noisy dinners, I thought I saw proof that all our giving had been rewarded. But somewhere along the line, things changed. I do not know the exact year, the exact conversation where the distance began, but I remember the gradual erosion. She married a man named David, an engineer with a smooth smile and expensive shoes. He was polite in the early days, but even then I could sense his careful watchfulness, as if he were always measuring me, evaluating whether I was useful or obsolete. After the wedding, the visits became less frequent. The grandchildren grew up without my stories, without the smell of motor oil and sawdust that once meant Grandpa's workshop. Margaret would cry quietly at night, asking me what we had done wrong, and I would reassure her that young families were busy, that modern life left little time for old-fashioned togetherness. Yet inside, I felt a slow gnawing fear that all the years of labor, all the savings, all the love we had poured into Karen might not be enough to hold her to us. When Margaret died, Karen did not come until 3 days after the funeral. She said she had a meeting she could not miss. I stood beside the casket alone, feeling the weight of decades, and my daughter was not there to place a hand on my shoulder. That was the first time I felt the cold edge of abandonment. And yet, when she finally arrived, when she hugged me stiffly in the living room and asked whether I would sell the house because it was too much for one person, I still forgave her. She was my daughter. I told myself grief makes people act strangely, that she would return to me once her life settled. But instead of drawing closer, she drifted further. Calls became transactional. Tuition for the kids, help with a car payment, money for a vacation. Each time I opened my wallet without complaint. What was the purpose of my savings if not to help her? And if her affection came only when she needed money, was it not still affection, however brief? 8 months ago, she and David bought a new house, a grand property in a gated community north of Chicago. The kind of place where the grass is clipped like velvet and the security gates shine brighter than any church steeple. Karen came to me with a smile, told me they needed $80,000 for the down payment. I gave it to her without hesitation. She promised me I would always be welcome there, that it was our house too, because without me, they could never have afforded it. I signed documents she handed me at the lawyer's office, not reading carefully because trust, in my world, was thicker than ink. I believed those papers meant a bond, a guarantee that there would always be a chair at their table, a bed for me if I grew too frail to live alone. I believed that after a lifetime of giving, I had secured my place in the heart of the family I helped build. For months after they moved, I waited for an invitation that never came. My calls went unanswered, my voicemails unreturned. When Karen did answer, her tone was brisk, almost irritated, as if my voice had become a burden. "Sorry, Dad, I'm busy. I'll call you back." The calls never came. I told myself they were adjusting, that new houses required time, that new communities demanded energy. But the longer the silence stretched, the more I felt like an outsider, as though I had donated a piece of myself only to be written out of the story. Each morning I would sit with my coffee, staring at the empty chair across from me, remembering Margaret's laughter, remembering Karen as a little girl with ribbons in her hair, asking me to push her higher on the swing. I could still hear her giggle, still see the sparkle in her eyes when she believed her father could catch the stars if she only asked. And now that same girl was unreachable, living behind gates I had paid to open, gates that would not recognize me as anything more than a stranger. I tell you all this so you understand the depth of my shock the morning I drove to her neighborhood with an old photo album under my arm. It was a simple gesture, a father bringing memories to a daughter who seemed to have forgotten her own. Inside were pictures of her first bike, of Margaret holding her newborn body, of the 3 of us on vacation at Lake Michigan. I thought, foolishly perhaps, that such reminders might soften her heart, that she would see me standing there not as an obligation, but as a piece of her own past she could not erase. Instead, I was stopped at the gate by a guard in a pressed uniform who looked at me with the flat politeness of a man doing his job. "Sir," he said after scanning his list, "I'm afraid you're on the blacklist. You are not permitted to enter the property." At first, I thought I had misheard. Blacklist? That was a word for criminals, for thieves and trespassers, not for a father who had given his daughter the very foundation under her feet. I laughed, expecting him to correct himself, but he did not smile. He repeated it calmly, as if it were a fact beyond dispute. I was blacklisted. The photo album grew heavy in my arms, my throat tightened, and in that moment I felt something break. Not the fragile hope that Karen might one day return to me, for that had been breaking slowly for years, but the belief that family could never truly disown you. That morning, at the gates of the house I helped buy, I learned how wrong I was. When I drove away from those gates that morning, the word the guard had used clung to me like a curse, circling through my mind, until it became unbearable. Blacklisted. I kept repeating it under my breath, trying to convince myself that there had been some sort of clerical error, that my name had been confused with another Lawson who owed money or caused trouble in the neighborhood. But deep down, I already knew the truth. That word had been placed there deliberately. It had been instructed by someone with authority, and the only person who would have issued that command was my own daughter. My hands shook on the steering wheel as I turned onto the main road, the photo album still unopened on the passenger seat, its leather cover shining dully in the sunlight as if mocking me. The idea that Karen had not only ignored me, but had gone so far as to officially bar me from her home, pressed against my chest, with a pressure that made it hard to breathe. I kept imagining Margaret's face, the way she used to defend Karen when I complained about her selfishness as a teenager. "She's our only one," Margaret would whisper. "She'll come around." What would Margaret say now if she knew her daughter had erased her father with a stroke of a pen and a line on a list? When I reached my house, the silence felt sharper than usual, cutting at me as I set the album down on the kitchen table and collapsed into the chair. I could not bring myself to open it, could not bear to see those smiling faces at the lake or in front of the Christmas tree, not when I had just been told that I was no longer welcome in the very life those photographs represented. For hours I sat there, my coffee cooling untouched, staring at the phone, willing it to ring with Karen's voice on the other end. An apology, an explanation, anything. It did not ring. Instead, 2 days later, an envelope arrived in the mail, thick, official, stamped by a downtown law firm whose name I recognized only vaguely from advertisements. I tore it open with a flicker of hope, thinking perhaps it was a clarification. Perhaps a misunderstanding had been acknowledged and corrected. But inside was a letter addressed to me formally, not as Dad, but as Mr. Lawson, informing me that in order to maintain the health and stability of her immediate household, my daughter, Mrs. Karen Whitman, had requested that I refrain from appearing at her residence without prior written notice and consent. The phrasing was legalistic, dry, almost mechanical, but between the lines I could feel her voice, cold and rehearsed, as though she were reading from a therapist's manual about boundaries. The letter closed with the chilling phrase, "Any further attempts to enter without permission may be considered trespassing." Trespassing. My own blood, the child I had raised from diapers, had instructed a lawyer to classify me as a potential trespasser, no different from a burglar or a vandal. I sat with the letter spread on the table beside the unopened album and felt an ache spread through me that words cannot fully describe. It was not merely rejection, it was annihilation of identity. The declaration that I was no longer father but outsider, no longer protector but intruder. I tried to call her then, dialing her number with trembling fingers, but it went to voicemail. I left a message, my voice breaking as I asked her to call me back, to tell me what I had done wrong, to tell me how I could make amends. The phone remained silent. Later that evening, I tried again, only to find my call cut short after a single ring. She had pressed the button. She had chosen not to hear me. That simple act felt sharper than any knife. I could not sleep that night. I wandered through the house, touching the walls, the furniture, the faded photographs that still hung in the hallway, each one a reminder of a family that had once seemed unshakable. I sat in Margaret's old armchair until dawn, watching the light change, wondering if perhaps Karen had been right all along when she accused me of being too stern, too silent, too practical. Maybe I had failed in some way invisible to me. Maybe my inability to say I love you as easily as others had planted seeds of resentment that bloom now in her decision to erase me. But then I would remember the car payments I had covered, the braces I had paid for, the late nights I had stayed awake waiting for her to come home safe, and I would feel anger boiling beneath the sorrow. A man cannot devote his entire life to a child and then be told he is nothing. The following week brought a second blow. I received a notice from my bank informing me that Karen had attempted to access funds from a joint account we had opened years ago when she was in college. She had claimed she was acting on my behalf, that I was no longer competent to manage my financial affairs. The bank had flagged the request for confirmation, and I stood in the office of the branch manager, stunned as she explained the situation. It was then I realized that the blacklist at the gate was not an isolated incident, but part of a larger deliberate effort to strip me of my autonomy, to confine me not only physically outside her home, but legally outside my own independence. The betrayal sank deeper, sharper, because it was not impulsive anger, but calculated planning. I drove back to her neighborhood once more, unable to restrain myself, my hands sweating on the wheel, the album still riding shotgun as if it demanded to be delivered. At the gate, the same guard stopped me, and when I pleaded, when I said, "Please, just call her. Tell her her father is here," he shook his head and pointed to the clipboard. "Sir, your name is here. You are blacklisted. I can't override this." I begged. I lowered my voice. I told him I was only trying to give her photographs of her mother. I even held up the album so he could see it was no weapon. But the guard's face remained blank, professional, distant. For the first time in my life, I felt not like a man, but like a ghost, seen, acknowledged, but denied existence. I drove away again, this time with tears blurring the road, my knuckles white against the wheel. That night I considered writing Karen a letter, pouring out everything I could not say over the phone. But each time I started the words twisted into accusations, into questions that had no answers. What had I done to deserve this? Was my only crime that I was old, that my presence embarrassed her in her polished new community? Did she think my worn jacket and stiff gait would tarnish her image among her neighbors with their perfect lawns and gleaming SUVs? I stared at the blank page until the ink in my pen dried, and then I crumpled it and threw it into the trash. I felt as though the only story left for me to write was my own erasure. The catalyst of my downfall was not the guard's voice or the lawyer's letter, or even the silence of my unanswered calls. It was the realization that Karen had not simply drifted from me, but had chosen to sever me, to cut me out of her life as one might prune a branch that had grown crooked. And the cruelest part was that she did it in the name of health, of stability, as though I were some contagion, a sickness that threatened her well-being. In that moment, I understood that what I faced was not merely distance or neglect, but exile, enforced with the authority of law, the complicity of institutions, and the cold indifference of my own child. That understanding became the fire beneath my grief, the turning point from sorrow into something darker, something that would drive me into the heart of a battle I had never imagined fighting at this age, a battle not for her love anymore, but for my dignity, for my right to exist as more than a man on a blacklist. I could have ignored the letter. I could have turned my back on the gatehouse and the man in uniform who spoke to me as if I were a nuisance instead of a father. But the longer I sat alone in my house with that unopened album on the table, the more something inside me refused to stay quiet. I had lived 76 years obeying the rules of decency, working honestly, paying bills on time, and keeping my promises even when it hurt me. But I had not lived this long to accept humiliation from my own blood without seeking an answer. For days I tried to speak to Karen on the phone, leaving messages that began as pleading and ended as fragments of silence, because my voice gave way to shame. But the silence from her end only grew heavier, as though each message I left was being collected not as proof of love, but as evidence against me. When another week passed without word, I made the decision that if she would not let me into her house, then I would find her outside of it, somewhere ordinary, somewhere she could not hide behind walls and guards and clipped legal phrases. It was a cold Thursday afternoon when I drove to the supermarket near her neighborhood, a place I knew she visited because Margaret used to tell me about their weekend shopping trips there years ago. I parked in the lot and waited, my eyes scanning each car that pulled in, each family walking out with bags. After almost an hour, I saw her stepping out of a silver SUV with her husband David at her side. Her hair pulled neatly back, her clothes immaculate in a way that made me feel immediately shabby in my heavy coat. For a moment, I felt the old paternal pride, the instinctive warmth at seeing my daughter's familiar figure, but it was quickly replaced by a surge of desperation. I approached slowly, careful not to startle her, the album once again in my arms, my voice unsteady as I called her name. She froze, her hand tightening on the strap of her purse, and when she turned to me, her face did not soften with recognition or affection, but hardened with something closer to fear, or perhaps calculation. "Dad," she said sharply, glancing quickly at David, before fixing her eyes back on me. "What are you doing here?" I tried to keep my voice gentle, tried to keep it from cracking under the weight of weeks of rejection. "I wanted to see you, Karen. Just to talk. They wouldn't let me through at the gate. They said I was blacklisted." Her lips pressed into a line, and she shifted her stance as though preparing herself for a confrontation in the middle of the parking lot. "You're not supposed to come to the house without calling first. I've told you that before." "No," I answered, shaking my head. "You didn't tell me that, Karen. You had a lawyer send me a letter. Cold words on a page. You didn't call me yourself. You didn't even answer when I tried to call you. Why would you do that to me? Why would you put me on a list, like a criminal?" David stepped forward then, his presence radiating the kind of controlled authority that always made me uneasy. "Henry," he said, in that practiced, measured voice of his, "this isn't the place for this conversation. You're upsetting Karen." I felt my hand tighten on the album, my fingers digging into the worn leather, and I forced myself to look only at my daughter. "Upsetting her? I came to bring you memories of your mother, Karen. Photographs of the woman who raised you, who loved you more than anything. I thought you might want to remember her, but they wouldn't even let me give this to you. They told me I was banned. By you." Karen's face flushed, and she glanced around as if embarrassed by the attention of strangers passing with carts. Her voice lowered, but sharpened, every word cut with the precision of someone rehearsed in therapy rooms and counseling sessions. "Dad, I've been talking with my therapist. We've been working on boundaries. You don't understand how suffocating you can be, how your expectations and your constant guilt weigh on me. I need space. I need to protect my family, and that means limiting your access. It's not about punishment, it's about health." The words stung, not because they were shouted, but because they were delivered calmly, as if diagnosing me with some condition. I felt myself shrinking beneath them, my chest tight, my throat dry. "Suffocating?" I whispered, struggling to keep my voice steady. Karen, I gave you everything. Every cent I saved. Every hour of my life. I worked until my hands bled so you could have more. How is that suffocating? David placed his hand lightly on her shoulder, a gesture that to anyone else might look protective, but to me felt like ownership, like control. Henry, times are different now. People take care of themselves differently. You need to understand that your role is not the same anymore. You can't just show up. You can't demand space in her life. She has to prioritize her own mental health. I turned on him then, unable to hold back the surge of anger that had been growing for weeks. Mental health. Is that what you call it? Locking out your own father, treating him like a disease. Did you tell her to blacklist me, David? Was that your idea? Because it sounds like your kind of solution. Neat, clean, efficient. Remove the old man from the picture so you don't have to deal with him. Karen's eyes flared, and she took a step back as if my words had cut too close to something she didn't want spoken aloud. Don't blame David for this, she snapped. This was my decision. I have to think of my children, of my marriage, of my stability. You always made everything about sacrifice, about what you gave up for me, and I can't carry that anymore. I need to live my life without feeling guilty for yours. I stared at her, stunned, the album slipping slightly in my grasp, as if even it could not bear the weight of her rejection. In that moment, I realized that this was not just a matter of misunderstanding or temporary anger. This was a severing, deliberate and complete, justified in her mind by phrases she had learned in counseling, but which to me sounded like daggers disguised as reason. I'm your father, I said finally, my voice breaking despite my efforts. That used to mean something. Karen's eyes softened for the briefest flicker of a second, and I thought I saw the girl she once was, the child who had once clung to my leg at the fair, begging for another ride. But the moment vanished as quickly as it came. She drew herself upright, adjusted her coat, and turned away. I can't do this right now, she muttered. Please don't follow me. And with that, she walked toward the store, David's arm guiding her forward, leaving me standing in the parking lot with the photo album pressed against my chest, as if I were holding the ashes of something already burned beyond recognition. People passed me without looking, cars honked distantly, life moved on around me, but I stood frozen in the knowledge that I had not merely been denied entry to her home. I had been denied entry to her heart, to the very role of father itself. When I finally returned to my car, I opened the album, something I had resisted for weeks, and the photographs swam before my eyes, images of birthdays and camping trips, of Margaret smiling with flour on her apron, of Karen laughing with a missing tooth at age 7. I traced the faces with trembling fingers, realizing that the people in those pictures no longer existed, that whatever bond they represented had been rewritten into a narrative of boundaries and health and blacklists. I closed the book gently, as though it were a coffin lid, and whispered into the empty car, "What have I done?" But no answer came, only the echo of my own breath, and the slow realization that the fight had only just begun. The encounter in the supermarket parking lot did not settle anything. It only widened the wound. For days afterward, I replayed Karen's words in my head, twisting them like a knife, hearing again her insistence that I was suffocating, that I was a burden on her stability, that my love was some form of guilt she no longer wished to carry. Each repetition of those words carved deeper into me until I began to question the very foundation of my life. Had I been so blind all these years, mistaking sacrifice for devotion, mistaking duty for affection? I wandered through my house like a man condemned, opening drawers, staring at old receipts and pay stubs as though the proof of my labor could rewrite the story my daughter now told about me. The ache of her rejection was unbearable, but beneath it pulsed a sharper fear that she was not done with me, that her words about boundaries and health were not just about emotional distance, but about something more permanent, a plan to remove me, not only from her life, but from my own control. That fear took form when I visited an old friend, Robert Haynes, a retired lawyer who had once helped me file the papers for Margaret's estate. We met in his cluttered study, the room heavy with the smell of dust and books, and I laid before him the copies of the documents Karen had once asked me to sign when she purchased her house. My hand shook as I pointed to the signatures, asking him to tell me what exactly I had agreed to, hoping desperately that the papers confirmed what Karen had promised, that I was still in some way a part of that house, that my contribution had not been erased. Robert adjusted his glasses, read slowly, his lips tightening as he scanned the pages, and then he placed them gently back on the desk. "Henry," he said softly, "I need you to understand that what you signed was not co-ownership. It was a gift agreement. $80,000 transferred as an unconditional contribution toward the purchase. You have no legal claim to that house, no rights of residence, no access. In fact, there's an addendum here, looks like it was notarized the same day, that explicitly states you waive any right to enter the property without prior consent." I felt the blood drain from my face as the words settled. A gift agreement, no rights, waived entry. My own daughter had not only taken my savings, but ensured through careful legal drafting that I could never lay claim to the place I believed would be my refuge in old age. It was not neglect, it was design. I thought back to the lawyer's office, to the way David had sat across the table with that wary look, to the way Karen had leaned close and smiled, reassuring me that it was just a formality. I remembered signing without reading, trusting because trust had always been the currency of our family. And now that trust had been converted into shackles. Robert looked at me with pity, but I could see he wanted to say more. After a long pause, he added, "Henry, I've seen this before. Children trying to preempt inheritance disputes, spouses pushing for financial control, therapists feeding language about toxic parents. It's not just about a house. If they've already gone to the trouble of blacklisting you and involving lawyers, they may be preparing to do more. You should be careful with your accounts, your medical records. If they declare you incompetent, they can strip you of everything." The room tilted around me, the bookshelves blurring, my hands gripping the armrest of the chair to keep from sliding into panic. Incompetent. The word hung there like a verdict waiting to be stamped. It was suddenly clear that the blacklist was not just an insult, not just an act of cruelty to humiliate me. It was part of a larger pattern, a tightening net. Karen's calm voice in the parking lot came back to me. Her talk of boundaries, her insistence that she needed protection from me, her mention of her therapist. And I realized she was not speaking casually. She was building a case, laying the groundwork for a narrative in which I was the aggressor, the unstable old man who could not let go, the man unfit to manage his own life. That night I barely slept. My dreams were filled with images of Margaret, her voice calling my name as she disappeared behind the gates of Karen's community, leaving me shouting for entry that never came. When I woke, the sheets were damp with sweat, and the house felt less like a home than a waiting room for erasure. I walked through the kitchen, the living room, the narrow hallway lined with photographs, and everywhere I looked, I saw evidence of a life that could be rewritten by a single accusation. What good were these walls, these memories, if a lawyer could stamp them out with the word incompetent? I tried calling Karen again, but when she answered at last, her tone was clipped, rehearsed, as though she had prepared every word. "Dad, I don't want to argue. This is for everyone's good. You need to trust that I know what's best. Please don't make this harder than it has to be." "Harder than what?" I demanded, my voice rising with desperation. "Harder than erasing me? Harder than stealing my savings? Harder than locking me out of your life? What exactly are you planning, Karen? Tell me what I've done that deserves this punishment." She was silent for a moment, and I could hear the faint hum of her children in the background, laughter and music, the life I was no longer allowed to touch. When she spoke again, her voice was steady but cold. "You never see it, Dad. You never see how controlling you are, how much pressure you put on me, how everything always circles back to what you gave and what I owe. I won't live like that anymore. I have a family now, and they come first. If that means I need to protect myself from you, then that's what I'll do." I sat in the kitchen holding the silent phone after she hung up, my pulse pounding in my temples, my chest aching. In that moment, I understood that the war had begun, not one of fists or raised voices, but of documents, diagnoses, and whispered stories that would paint me as a man I had never been. It was no longer a matter of being invited to dinner or allowed past a guardhouse. It was about survival. The midpoint of my descent was not simply discovering that I had no legal right to the house I paid for, but the realization that my daughter was preparing to declare me a relic, a danger, a man unfit for his own life. The betrayal was no longer emotional, but existential. The daughter I had raised had become the architect of my disappearance. From that night forward, I knew that every action I took, every word I spoke, would be watched, measured, and possibly used against me. And in that knowledge, grief transformed into a grim determination. If Karen wanted to erase me, I would have to fight not only for my dignity, but for the right to remain myself in a world that had already begun to treat me as a ghost. After my conversation with Robert, after the papers confirmed what my heart already suspected, I told myself that the worst had already happened. I had been denied entry, my money had been taken under the disguise of a gift. My daughter had made it clear that she saw me not as a father, but as a burden. I believed there was no deeper pit to fall into, that the wound could not possibly widen further. But betrayal has layers, like rings in a tree, each one marking another year of erosion. And in the weeks that followed, I discovered that my daughter and her husband were not finished with me. They were only just beginning. It started with phone calls from numbers I did not recognize, polite voices from offices downtown asking whether I had considered appointing a power of attorney, whether I had thought about the management of my estate, whether I was aware that my family was concerned about my declining capacity. The first time I heard those words, I nearly dropped the phone. Declining capacity. I stammered that I was fine, that I had been managing my affairs for years without issue. But the caller pressed on, reminding me that sometimes it is easier to accept help before it is forced upon you. The implication sat like poison in my stomach. I hung up, shaking, realizing that someone had put my name on a list, that someone had made calls in my name. When I checked the envelopes piling up at the door, I found glossy brochures from elder law attorneys, pamphlets about guardianship, even invitations to seminars about protecting assets from self-destructive decisions. I did not need to ask who had arranged these mailings. Not long after, I discovered that Karen had contacted my doctor. The nurse, who had known me for years, let it slip during a routine visit. "Your daughter asked for your medical records, Mr. Lawson," she said carefully, her eyes full of hesitation. "She said she was worried about memory issues. We couldn't release anything without your signature, of course, but she was very insistent." My throat went dry, my palms damp, and for a moment I thought I might faint right there in the exam room. Memory issues. I had my lapses, of course, names slipping, appointments forgotten. But what 76-year-old did not? Margaret used to lose her glasses 3 times a day, and no one dared call her incompetent. But in the hands of a daughter who had already erased me from her home, those small forgettings could become a weapon, an argument that I was no longer fit to decide for myself. At night, the fear turned into anger, a restless pounding in my chest that would not let me sleep. I would walk through the house in the dark, my footsteps echoing on the wooden floors, and think of the decades of work that had gone into every corner of that home. I thought of the years Margaret and I had lived modestly so Karen could attend private schools, so she could travel, so she could stand tall among her peers without shame. I thought of the way I had signed away my savings to put her in that new house, believing foolishly that generosity would bind her closer to me. Now I saw it clearly. Generosity had been rewritten as weakness. Trust had been converted into leverage, and every sacrifice I had made was now being used to cut me out of existence. The second escalation came with the arrival of another letter, heavier than the first, this one delivered by certified mail. I signed for it at the door, my hand trembling as the postman handed me the envelope with its bold law firm insignia. Inside was a formal notice. Karen and David, through their attorney, had filed a petition to establish guardianship. The petition alleged that I was no longer able to make sound financial decisions, that I was at risk of exploitation, that my judgment was compromised by grief and age. They cited my erratic behavior, including my unauthorized appearances at their residence and my attempts to confront them in public spaces. They listed my calls, my messages, my pleas, not as proof of love, but as evidence of harassment, as signs of an unstable mind. At the bottom was a chilling request that the court grant Karen and David authority over my financial accounts, my health care decisions, and my property. I sat in my kitchen with that letter spread before me, the clock ticking loudly on the wall, my heart pounding so violently I thought it might burst. It was not just betrayal now. It was theft in broad daylight, executed with legal ink and court stamps. My own daughter was preparing to strip me of the last things I had left: my independence, my money, my right to decide how I lived or died. I felt the air tighten around me, my breath shallow, and I gripped the table until my knuckles went white. If Margaret had been alive, she would have fallen to her knees weeping. She always believed Karen had a soft heart beneath her sharpness, always told me to forgive her missteps. But here was the proof that whatever softness had once lived in my daughter had been hardened into calculation, into cruelty. Desperation pushed me to action. I called Robert again, my voice shaking as I read him the petition. He listened in silence, then sighed heavily. "Henry, they're building a case. The courts don't decide these things lightly. But if they have letters, if they can show you've been calling repeatedly, if they've got testimony from therapists, it can sway a judge. You need to be careful. Everything you do now can be twisted against you." "But it's lies," I whispered. "I'm not incompetent. I'm not unstable. I'm just a father trying to see his daughter." "I know," Robert said softly, "but the truth isn't always enough." His words sank into me like stones. That night I thought about every man I had known in my lifetime who had been discarded in old age, the fathers whose children took their pensions, the grandfathers locked away in nursing homes, the men who once worked proudly with their hands, but ended their lives staring blankly at walls. I had always believed I would die with dignity, that Karen would hold my hand, as Margaret once did. that love would close the circle of my life. But now I saw another future, a courtroom where my own daughter argued that I was no longer fit, a judge signing away my rights, a nursing facility where I would be left to wither. The thought made me tremble with a mixture of rage and terror. And as if the legal battle was not enough, the social humiliation began. One evening a neighbor knocked gently at my door, an older woman who had always been kind to Margaret. She held her phone in her hand, her face awkward. "Henry," she said hesitantly, "I thought you should know. Your daughter posted something online. About you. She said you've been harassing her, that you're unstable, that you've been showing up uninvited and scaring the grandchildren. People in the community are talking." I took the phone from her trembling hands and read the post. Karen's words glared back at me, careful, reasonable, full of the same polished therapy language she had used in the parking lot. She wrote that she was setting boundaries for her mental health, that her father's behavior had become invasive, that she hoped others would understand the difficult decision to cut ties. There were comments beneath, supportive voices praising her bravery, urging her to protect her family. Not one asked about me. Not one questioned the other side of the story. I was already erased in the eyes of strangers, turned into a caricature of a toxic father by the woman I had raised with every ounce of my strength. The second escalation was not a single blow, but a series of strikes, each one designed to weaken me further. The petition, the medical inquiries, the social humiliation. My name was being blackened, my voice silenced, my identity rewritten. I could feel the ground shrinking beneath me, each day bringing me closer to the edge of a precipice I had not seen coming. And yet, deep beneath the fear and sorrow, a different fire began to burn. It was not the desperate hope of reconciliation anymore, not the plea for my daughter to remember who I was. It was the raw instinct of survival, the same instinct that had carried me through years of labor, through nights when bills piled high and hope seemed thin. They wanted me erased. They wanted me incompetent. They wanted me silent. But I was still alive, still breathing, and as long as breath filled my lungs, I would not go quietly into the role they had written for me. The second escalation was the breaking point, the moment when grief could no longer stand alone, when sorrow was forced to harden into resolve. They had taken my money. They had taken my place in their home, and now they sought to take my very identity. The battle ahead would be merciless, but I understood now that it was not about their love anymore. It was about my dignity, my right to die as the man I had lived, not as the ghost they wanted to invent. The petition for guardianship sat like a bomb on my kitchen table, daring me to defuse it or let it explode. And for days I stared at it until the words blurred into shadows. Every line carried the weight of my daughter's betrayal, each phrase an accusation that did not belong to me, but to the story she and David had crafted. Unstable, intrusive, incompetent. I felt trapped in a cage of paper, walls built not of iron, but of legal ink, yet every bit as suffocating. There comes a moment in every man's life when fear has to break into something else, when silence becomes more dangerous than speaking, and for me that moment came late one night as I sat in Margaret's old chair, listening to the hollow ticking of the clock. I realized that if I did nothing, I would lose everything, not just my money or my house, but the very right to call myself a man. I had been erased in private, blacklisted at a gate, silenced by lawyers and online posts, but now they wanted to erase me publicly in the eyes of the court, and if I allowed it, there would be no return. Something in me hardened then, a voice I had not heard since my younger days when I fought to keep my business alive against banks and bills. I would not go quietly. The next morning, with trembling hands, but steady purpose, I wrote a letter, not to Karen, not to David, but to the local newspaper. I told them my story in plain words, how I had given my daughter $80,000 for her house, how I had been blacklisted from entering, how lawyers now called me incompetent while I sat alone in the home I had built with my own hands. I did not dress it up with melodrama. I did not accuse her of cruelty in shrill tones. I simply laid out the facts, anchored with the truth of a father's grief. I attached a photograph of the album, Margaret's face smiling from one of its pages, and I ended the letter with a line that had burned in me for weeks. If a man can spend his life working for his family only to be declared a trespasser in their lives, then what does the word father even mean? I expected nothing to come of it, maybe a polite rejection, maybe silence. But 2 days later, the editor called. He told me my letter would run in Sunday's edition, not buried in the back pages, but printed prominently as a personal essay. His voice carried sympathy, but also a kind of urgency, as if he knew the story spoke to something larger than me. And when the paper came out, my quiet grief became a public wound. Strangers began to reach out, some through letters, some through phone calls tracked through the directory, men and women who had lived through similar betrayals, who had been stripped of dignity by children they once cradled. One man wrote, "Your words are mine. My son did the same. I died the day he called me a burden." Another said, "Hold on. You are not alone." The flood of voices steadied me in a way no lawyer ever could. I was no longer a silent ghost. The reaction did not stop at sympathy. A local blogger picked up my story, published it with photographs of the newspaper clipping, and within days the piece spread across community boards and social networks. People debated fiercely, some condemning Karen for her cruelty, others defending her right to boundaries. But what mattered was that my silence had been broken, that the truth was no longer confined to my kitchen table. And then, almost inevitably, Karen herself appeared at my door. It was a cold evening, the sun already gone, when her car pulled into my driveway. She stepped out quickly, her coat pulled tight, her face sharp with anger I had not seen in years. She did not knock politely but hammered on the door until I opened it, and she stood there, her eyes blazing, her words spilling before I could even greet her. "How could you do this, Dad? How could you drag our family into the public eye? Humiliate me, humiliate David, expose us to strangers? Do you know what people are saying about us? Do you know what you've done?" I let her speak, standing quietly, my hand resting on the frame of the door. When she paused for breath, I turned and walked to the living room, leaving the door open behind me. She followed, furious, her heels clicking on the floor. I picked up the key that lay on the coffee table, the spare to this house, the house Margaret and I had filled with laughter and arguments and quiet nights of shared tea. I held it out to her. "Take it," I said quietly. She blinked, thrown off by the calmness in my tone. "What are you talking about?" "Take the key," I repeated. "You already took the money. You already took the right to lock me out of your house. You already took the right to call me a trespasser in your life. Take this house, too, if that's what you want. But there's one thing you will never take, Karen. You will never take my conscience, and you will never take the truth." Her lips parted, her anger faltering for a moment, and I pressed on, my voice firmer, rising with the weight of everything I had carried. "You've built a story about me, painted me as dangerous, unstable, suffocating. You think words like boundaries and health will disguise what this really is. Abandonment. You abandoned your mother when she lay dying. You abandoned me at the funeral. And now you abandon the man who gave you everything. You can take my money. You can smear my name. You can even try to silence me in court, but you cannot erase the truth. And now the world knows it. They know who I am, and they know what you've done." For a long moment she said nothing, her face pale, her eyes flashing between fury and something else I could not name, perhaps shame, perhaps fear. She turned the key over in her hand, her knuckles white, and then she set it back on the table as if it burned her. "You've ruined everything," she whispered. "You've made it impossible to fix this." I looked at her steadily, feeling a calmness settle in me for the first time in months. "No, Karen, you ruined everything when you decided that your father was worth less than your comfort. I only told the truth." She spun and stormed out, slamming the door behind her, and the echo rang through the house like a final chord. I sank into Margaret's chair, exhausted, trembling, but alive in a way I had not felt since the blacklist at the gate. The climax had not been a courtroom, not yet, nor a physical battle, but the moment when I stood my ground, when I refused to accept the story they had written for me. For the first time, I felt that I had reclaimed something they could not touch. My voice, my dignity, my right to exist not as a trespasser, but as a man who had spoken the truth. After Karen stormed out of my house that evening, the echo of the door slamming lingered like a final punctuation mark to a sentence I had never wanted to write. The silence that followed was different from the silence I had endured in previous months. It was not the silence of waiting for a phone call that would never come, nor the silence of being blacklisted at a gate, but the silence that comes after truth has been spoken, when there is nothing more to lose and nothing left to hide. For the first time in years, I did not feel like a man begging for scraps of affection. I felt like a man who had finally stood in the center of his own life and refused to be erased. In the days that followed, the noise outside my home grew louder. The article in the newspaper spread further, shared by people I had never met, commented on by strangers who saw in my story the reflection of their own fathers or grandfathers. Some voices defended Karen, saying children had the right to set boundaries. Others condemned her, saying a daughter who blacklists her father betrays more than just a man. She betrays her own roots. I read the debates with a mixture of sorrow and relief. Sorrow because my private heartbreak had become public spectacle. Relief because the story was no longer one-sided. For too long my voice had been silenced in legal letters and unanswered calls. Now, whether people judged me kindly or harshly, at least I was heard. One afternoon, about a week later, a woman came to my door. She introduced herself as Linda, a neighbor of Karen's in the gated community, and in her hands she held a folded newspaper. Her face carried the weariness of someone who had seen too much of life, and when she spoke, her voice trembled with emotion. "Mr. Lawson," she said softly, "I read your story. My own mother went through something similar. My brother took control of her finances, put her in a home, and I barely saw her before she died. I wanted to tell you, you are not alone." She pressed the paper into my hand, and I realized she had marked a section of the article where readers had written responses, letters of support and sympathy. Reading those words from people who had nothing to gain by comforting me, I felt the beginning of something I had thought impossible. Community. Soon after, another invitation arrived. This time not from lawyers or banks or courts, but from a local club of retired men who met weekly at a park shelter near the river. They called themselves the Unclaimed, a name that struck me with both humor and pain, and they invited me to join. At first, I hesitated. I had lived so long in the shell of isolation that the idea of sitting among strangers felt unnatural. But on a Saturday morning, I drove down, carrying nothing but a thermos of coffee, and there I found a circle of men in folding chairs, each with stories etched into the lines of their faces. One had been cut off by his children after a bitter divorce. Another had been placed in assisted living against his will before managing to escape through legal battles. A third simply said, "My daughter stopped calling the day I told her I couldn't keep paying her rent." We sat together, we spoke, we laughed, we grieved. For the first time since Margaret died, I did not feel invisible. In the weeks that followed, I built a new rhythm. I still walked through my house at night, still paused by the photographs of Margaret and Karen when she was a child, still felt the ache of what had been stolen from me. But I also carried with me the voices of those men, the letters from strangers, the unexpected kindness of people who knew the sharp edge of abandonment. Slowly, I came to see that while my daughter had chosen to sever me, life had given me another family, one bound not by blood, but by shared wounds, and the stubborn refusal to let those wounds silence us. Karen did not return. I did not expect her to. The petition for guardianship, I learned through Robert, had been quietly withdrawn, perhaps out of fear of further public exposure, perhaps out of simple calculation that the battle was not worth the scrutiny. In its place, there was only silence, but this time I did not mistake silence for emptiness. It was a space in which I could breathe without waiting for the next strike. It was, in its own way, freedom. One evening, as I sat at the park with the men of the unclaimed, someone handed me a letter that had been mailed to the group's address. It was from a woman in Arizona who had read my essay online. Her words trembled with sorrow. "My father died in a nursing home last year. I cut him off when I believed the things my husband told me about him. Reading your story, I see now what I did, and I can't change it. I wish I had understood sooner. Please know that your words matter, that you may save someone else from making the same mistake I did." I read the letter aloud, and as I did, the men around me sat in silence, their eyes glistening, their heads bowed. It was then I understood that the meaning of my suffering was no longer confined to my own life. My voice had become part of something larger, a chorus of fathers who refused to vanish quietly. In the end, resolution did not come in the form of reconciliation with Karen. There was no dramatic return, no sudden apology, no final embrace. Resolution came in the acceptance that sometimes justice is not about winning back what was lost, but about refusing to surrender what remains. My daughter may never again see me as her father, but I will always know what I gave, what I endured, and what I stood for when the world tried to silence me. And as I sit among men who share that same wound, as I listen to the laughter of strangers who have become brothers, I know that dignity can survive, even when love does not.